on the phone, we have with us Alex de Waal. He's the executive director of the World Peace Foundation, professor at Tufts University, Fletcher School of Law and Policy. Professor, thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Let's, if you could, I mean, this is a conflict that's been going on for 2 years, at least, I guess, in this form. There was, for many, many years, a conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Can you just set sort of the context for us? What changed? You know, what were we talking about when Eritrea and Ethiopia were at war, and what changed from then in terms of leadership, and then maybe walk us up to what ignited the conflict with the Tigray region and Ethiopia, and I guess Eritrea as well, and the Amhara.
So the basic story is this: for about 25 years, from the early 1990s, there were two rival governments in Ethiopia and the former Ethiopian province of Eritrea, which had got independence in 1993. And the Ethiopian government was authoritarian but relatively open, a very effective developmental state, rapid economic growth, and a sort of an anchor of peace and security in the region. So very popular with Western countries for its stand in fighting terrorism. It was an attractive target for investment. And although it was authoritarian, it wasn't totalitarian. Eritrea, on the other hand, was a totally totalitarian state with no political parties, no judiciary, no budget, published no constitution, totally a one-man show under its president, Isaias Afwerki. That changed in about 4 years ago when a new prime minister was chosen from within the ruling party in Ethiopia. His name is Abiy Ahmed, and he displaced the group that had been running Ethiopia for the previous 27 or so years, which had its roots in Tigray, the northernmost region of Ethiopia, right next door to Eritrea, and the group that was really disliked, indeed hated, by the Eritrean dictator, Isaias Afwerki. Now, what Abiy did, and it won him the Nobel Prize, was he flew to Eritrea and said, let's make peace, let's normalize relations. Now, what wasn't really properly analyzed, understood internationally at the time, was that peace deal, which was never really made public, was really a security pact between the two leaders, Abiy Ahmed, the young, energetic, supposedly reformist prime minister in Ethiopia, who was doing things like releasing political prisoners and promising radical liberal change, and the old, wily fox of a dictator, Isaias Afwerki. They had decided to gang up and destroy the region of Tigray in the name of eliminating its leadership. So a political dispute among the Ethiopian elite between the former leaders, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, and the incoming ruler, was sort of conjoined with this life and death struggle between the Tigrayans and Eritrea. And 2 years ago, this erupted into outright war. It's been an
Professor, may I stop you there and just ask a couple of questions, just so that we can take it up to that point. To what extent was the prior leadership that was Tigrayan, the longtime leadership in Ethiopia, where does what region of the country does Ahmed come from, and what is there are there ethnic differences between the Tigrayans and Ahmed's background?
So historically, if we look back in the history of Ethiopia over the last few centuries, the country's been dominated by a group called the Amhara, and many people will be familiar with Emperor Haile Selassie and his feudal aristocratic rule. And Haile Selassie was an Amhara, and the images we have of Ethiopians with the Orthodox Church and all those symbols of traditional Ethiopian culture are basically the Amhara. Now, the largest group in Ethiopia is not actually the Amhara, but the group immediately to the south, the Oromo, who until Haile Selassie was overthrown in a bloody revolution in 1974, until then, the Oromo were very much second-class citizens. They were serfs. They basically didn't own land. They worked on others' land and so on. And the main ethnic struggle in Ethiopia was between the Amhara and the Ethiopia and the Amhara. I'm sorry, the Amhara and the Oromo. But the Tigrayans gained power after a long war in the 1970s and 1980s and sort of held the ring. Now, in about 6-7 years ago, there was a widespread, largely non-violent youth uprising among the Oromo, saying, we've been shut out of power for too long. We want change. And this was what brought down the former ruling coalition and ushered in change. But the leaders of that non-violent democratic revolution could not assume the prime ministership. They were not represented in parliament, so they opted as an interim choice to have an Oromo leader called Abiy Ahmed, just to hold the ring until elections were held. But Abiy Ahmed had different ideas. He was very ambitious, even megalomaniac, and he immediately started concentrating power in his own hands. And in fact, his first moves were against the Oromo themselves, against that power base that had brought him to office. And he started suppressing them and indeed waging war against them before embarking on his larger war against the Tigrayans.
Well, and then I want to pick it up from the start of the conflict with the Tigrayans, but I can't quite figure out what these wars, like, what are the spoils here? 25 years ago, I had visited Addis Ababa, and I just remember being, I think it was in a cab, and someone explaining to me the conflict between Eritrea and Ethiopia as two bald men fighting over a comb. Like what are the spoils here? Is this a resource thing? I mean, what does it mean to have power in the context of Ethiopian or even that regional politics there?
That's a very good question. And the war between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which was viciously fought some 25 years ago, was ostensibly a border war, and hence the description of it as bald men fighting over a comb, because the actual disputed border area was barren. It really had no resources at all. But the real conflict between Ethiopia and Eritrea, indeed between the Ethiopian leadership, which was Tigrayan at the time, and Eritrea, was over who would be at the top, who would be head of the hierarchy of power in Northeast Africa. And then the conflict within Ethiopia, the dispute between Abiy and the Amhara and the Tigrayans, and then increasingly with the Oromos as well, who are broken with Abiy, is really a question of pure power. Who will run this Ethiopian state, which in the last 25, 30 years has become a much more effective and capable state than it was on the previous regimes. It's had a lot of economic growth. So it's really essentially purely a political conflict over who's in power, who runs the show.
Thank you. And so that takes us up to 2 years ago. And this conflict is a function of this deal that I guess Ahmed is strikes with Eritrea to solidify his power within Ethiopia, and it includes essentially a security pact that is primarily aimed, it seems, at the Tigrayans.
That's correct. It is for Abiy Ahmed. He basically his clear political reasoning is he fears the Tigrayans are still a capable political rival, and he wants to reduce their power. For Isaias Afwerki, it's something more. He sees Tigray really as an existential threat, and he has never hidden his intention, his frankly genocidal intention, of not only defeating the TPLF, but actually crushing the people of Tigray in such a way that they will be set back 30 or more years, reduced to a state of really driven back to the Stone Age. So 2 years ago, they amassed their armies, their respective armies, on the borders of Tigray, and the Tigrayans and the narrative that came out at the time was that this was a law enforcement operation by the government in Addis Ababa, that is Abiy Ahmed, in response to the Tigrayan action. But in fact, the Tigrayans struck first, in the same sense that the first shots in World War II were fired by the Polish government rather than by the Nazis. It was clearly there was a military intention of overrunning Tigray, and indeed that is what happened in the first stages of the war. And then the Tigrayans reorganized. They fled to the mountains. It's a very mountainous area, very hospitable for guerrilla warfare. And they reorganized. They mounted a resistance, and the main reason why their resistance was so successful was the level of atrocities and destruction inflicted on the Tigrayan people by the combined forces of the federal government under Abiy Ahmed and the Eritreans under Isaias Afwerki, so antagonized, so alienated the ordinary people of Tigray that they flocked to take up weapons and resist the occupier.
And his fear of the Tigrayans, that's based on their sheer numbers, right? And also, I mean, what is it as well as that? Is their level of political organization against him formidable in and of itself as well?
Well, the Tigrayans actually are a relatively small minority. So Ethiopia as a whole is about 120 million. The Tigrayans are about between 5 and 6 million. So they're relatively small. And in fact, one of the points that alarmed many international diplomats was that Abiy Ahmed candidly said to them, he said this to the US Special Envoy, the European Special Envoy, who cares about these 5 million people? Ethiopia is much bigger. We have more than 100 million people. What Abiy, I think, was afraid of was that the Tigrayans do have this reputation of being very well organized and being very formidable fighters. And that is, in fact, what they proved during the 2 years of war. They were able to repeatedly defeat much, much larger armies sent to them, against them by the federal government in Ethiopia, the regional state of Amhara next door, which is much, much bigger than Tigray, and the Eritreans, who are about the same size as Tigray, 5 million, but also very well organized with a huge army. So the Tigrayans showed their battlefield prowess, and during the first year of war, not only drove out the occupying forces out of Tigray, but at one point, about a year ago, actually marched to within 150 miles or so of the capital, Addis Ababa.
And so at one point the Ethiopian government, and I guess Eritrea, decided that the way to defeat the TDF was to was to essentially starve the people of Tigray.
That's absolutely correct. The key weapon, and sadly the most effective weapon they had, was starvation. And this war of starvation unfolded in two phases. The first was when they were actually in occupation of Tigray, which was from about the end of November of 2020 for about 8 months. And that was a period of pillaging and looting, stealing food, destroying businesses, closing the banks, stealing the money, destroying the health infrastructure, the water infrastructure, raping tens, if not hundreds of thousands of women and girls, and so on. So destroying everything that was there to sustain life, to sustain livelihoods and development, driving people off their land, etc. And then when the Tigrayans had drove out the occupiers and controlled Tigray, they were completely surrounded. And what the Ethiopian and Eritrean forces did was they enforced a blockade, which meant almost no humanitarian aid went in. And all banking services, telecommunications, trade, etc., was completely shut off. So all those people who had their life savings in banks, in insurance schemes, and so on, couldn't get hold of any money. No one could be paid. Business ground to a halt, and then virtually no aid was allowed in. And then when the war resumed in August of this year, and the advancing armies of Ethiopia and Eritrea overran quite significant areas of Tigray again, more than 1 million people were displaced, and they simply had absolutely nowhere to go, no shelter, no food, no medicine, and it really looked as though hundreds of thousands would die. In fact, the death toll from famine during the last 2 years is estimated at about 600,000. That's about 1 in 10 Tigrayans perished of hunger and disease during this period. It's a terrible toll.
So where has the UN been during this time? Where has the United States been during this time? I don't know other players. I know that China at one point had invested heavily in Ethiopia. I don't know if that has continued. But where is the rest of the world while this is happening?
Pretty much looking the other way is the answer to that. Normally one would expect the African Union to take a lead in addressing conflict in Africa. In this case, the African Union headquarters is in the Ethiopian capital, Addis Ababa, and has always been somewhat under the thumb of the Ethiopian government. So right at the beginning, when African leaders began to mobilize, they sent a delegation of 3 former heads of state to Addis Ababa to press for peace. And they were rebuffed, and the African Union actually then said, no, we'll handle this as a domestic matter. We won't invoke our peace and security mechanisms to respond to this. And what should then have happened is the UN Security Council should have taken it up. But the Ethiopians found they had strong allies in China and Russia, and which threatened vetoes, and the Western nations, which were initially very concerned, weren't able to override that. When President Biden took office, he appointed a special envoy, and began in his first months in office making some very strong statements, saying that the level of ethnic cleansing, of mass rape, of starvation was completely unacceptable. But he got very little diplomatic traction. And there wasn't much popular outrage, partly because the very, very little press coverage. And so, the conscience of ordinary people has not really been stirred around this. And after a while, the U.S. policy has been very much, let's stick with the devil we know, that is Abiy Ahmed, rather than trying to engineer some form of power sharing or changing government. They just didn't want to go down that road. And so the U.S. has been pretty weak in and pretty slow in pushing for peace negotiations and for humanitarian access to save the starving.
Well, I mean, we have been asked to cover this for months and months, and to some extent, we don't have the resources to be doing on the ground reporting, and no one here has a particular expertise in that area, and it has really taken a long time for us to get just even a handle on who we should bring on to talk about it, because we have no sort of mechanism to even assess what people coming on, and it does feel like there is a tremendous amount of information warfare, if you will, for lack of a better term, coming out of this conflict to obscure the basis of the conflict and what's actually happening on the ground. There feels like there has been a failure across multiple, I guess, mechanisms, including the UN and including journalism, in addressing this. With 600,000 people die, and in a matter of what effectively is months. Give me your sense of that.
I think that's absolutely correct. I mean, it's remarkable that the last international journalist who was able to travel into Tigray was Declan Walsh of the New York Times, who went in June of last year. So that is 18 months ago. There hasn't been a single international journalist permitted in since then. And that information blockade, blackout seems, unfortunately, to work. It means that there is very little reporting, and we would expect that humanitarian workers of whom a certain number, a small number, were allowed in, would not, in normal circumstances, would also be reporting. They'd be gathering data, but they've not been allowed to speak out. Basically any aid worker who comes out of Tigray and comes out with pictures or with data is told, if you make these available, your organization will be expelled from the country. And 14 months ago, the Ethiopians expelled a number of very senior UN aid workers for precisely this reason, and they got the others to shut up very effectively. And you add on to this a very aggressive social media campaign, so that people like me who've spoken out about it, we are deluged with really hateful social media messages and campaigns, with my university being, deluged with demands that I be fired and so on. And most of the people who would normally be writing columns about this and so on, it's you have to have a very thick skin to continue writing when you know you will be relentlessly attacked and defamed in this way. But one thing that we're just beginning to see now, because the conflict isn't just in Tigray, it's in other parts of Ethiopia too, and the same people who purvey these very hateful, violence-inciting social media messages have got such a sense of impunity that they're losing a sense of proportion and restraint. So that over the last week, from the south of the country, from the Oromo area where the conflict is also ongoing, they've been circulating videos of the militiamen parading around villages with severed heads on sticks, and videos of people being burned alive or even skinned alive, the sort of medieval barbarism that you wouldn't expect to see in the 21st century. And I think that is beginning to wake up a wider constituency to just how horrible this war is and how gross the atrocities that are being perpetrated are.
What's your sense of where this disinformation campaign, or I mean, we know the source of the media blackout, right? It's a crackdown. But in terms of who might be organizing it online to suppress it from getting to a international audience, can you speculate on that?
Oh, it doesn't. You don't need to speculate. It's very clear that there are certain diaspora Ethiopian groups that are organizing this, and they are encouraged and on occasions organized and financed by the Ethiopian government, by Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed. About a year ago, he actually dismissed most of his ambassadors because he said they weren't doing a good enough job. And he said, well, our Twitter lions are doing a far better job, and these are the people who should be given the resources for advocating on our behalf.
Several weeks ago, there was two separate, I guess, treaties signed. The first was in Pretoria, South Africa. The second in Nairobi. The first, if my understanding is correct, was a cessation of hostilities, and the second was essentially a way of making that permanent and a deal. Political concessions by the Tigrayans in exchange for ostensibly for aid to come in and keep people from dying of starvation. Give us your assessment of both those agreements and what has taken place in the wake of the signing of those agreements.
Well, the immediate background to this is that at the end of August, there was this enormous new offensive was mounted by the combined armies of Ethiopia and Eritrea, with many, many militia as well. And the Tigrayans, who were in defensive positions, were inflicting enormous casualties. And they assumed that the level of casualties that they were inflicting, especially on the non-commissioned officers and the junior officers, was such that the Ethiopians would give up after a few weeks. Didn't happen. 70 days of non-stop fighting and attacks. And the level of fatalities is quite extraordinary. The Ethiopian chief of staff himself admitted that his army, his regular army, had lost 136,000 dead in those 10 weeks of fighting. The fatalities among the militia are probably higher. The fatalities among the Eritreans probably almost as high. So that is a level of death and destruction actually at the battlefront that I don't think we've seen since World War II. And just dwell on those figures. I mean, probably 350,000 dead on one side in a matter of weeks is quite horrifying. And what the Tigrayans basically discovered, they were suffering too, but much lower numbers because they were in defensive positions, was that the Prime Minister Abiy and President Isaias were ready to continue losing hundreds of thousands of young people at the front in order to prevail in this war. And the arithmetic just didn't add up for the defenders. They just had to recognize either they would be completely wiped out or they would have to sue for peace. So at the first opportunity, in fact, the only opportunity, which was the African Union summoned them for peace talks, on the assumption, actually, the African Union assumed that they would have surrendered by then. They would have been defeated. But as it happened, they weren't defeated, but they went And they said, okay, we will sue for peace. We will accept very adverse political terms in order to stop the fighting, in order to stop this extraordinary level of destruction and loss of life. And so that agreement was signed in Pretoria on November the 2nd after 8 days of talks. It's not a good agreement. It's a hastily patched together agreement. And essentially it is, as you say, a deal in which the Tigrayans concede their main political demands. They will dismantle their political party and their regional government in return for getting aid and having a ceasefire. And then the details of the ceasefire were then worked out in a subsequent round of negotiations in Nairobi the following week. And the basic deal there is that the Tigrayans will disarm, but only when the Eritreans have withdrawn. Now, what we have seen over the month or so since the signing of these two agreements is not much. There is certainly, the fighting has stopped, and that's good. Some aid has come in, some services have been restored. That's good. But banks aren't functioning, telephone isn't functioning, hospitals really are still not running, and the Eritreans are still there, and they're still actually killing and looting. And meanwhile, in other parts of Ethiopia, especially in Oromia, the war is intensifying. So the forces that were fighting in Tigray have been relocated to a new front. The drones that were flying over Tigray and on a daily basis 2 months ago are now attacking sites in other parts of Ethiopia. So if a cessation of fighting in Tigray just means an intensification of fighting elsewhere in Ethiopia, this is not good news.
How does a regime, I'm talking about the Eritrean and the Ethiopian Ahmed regime, how does it sustain losses like that? Tens of thousands of like domestically, is there no pressure? I guess this is a two-parter. A, is there no pressure domestically? I mean, I guess if you're living in a totalitarian state, there isn't necessarily a huge opportunity for it. And there's no reason to believe that there's necessarily any better information traveling domestically than there is internationally, I guess, at this point. But also, I would add, as a second part of that question, if Ahmed starts to attack the Orama, is there not opportunity for some type of like united front from the Tigrayans, or they basically just need to, make sure that they don't have continued widespread starvation?
So there are two very good questions, and actually every time I speak to an Ethiopian, I ask the first question. I say, what are people in Ethiopia saying about this level of losses? How is it that it is still possible, after losing, several 100,000 young men and young women at the front line, that still there are tens of thousands of young people being trained and sent into this meat grinder? And the answer I get is, they don't know what's going on. The information control is so complete that these young people who go to training camps think that they are just going to go for a walkover, or they're going to do peacekeeping or policing duties in areas where normality has returned. And there's stories of young. There was one story I was hearing, a young woman who was captured by the Tigrayans, and she hadn't even understood that she was actually in a battle. Her whole force had surrendered without really firing a shot because they didn't know how to use their weapons. And she was just asking for her cell phone. She said, "Oh, I've lost my cell phone. Who are you? Where? What's going on? How can I call my mother?" And we hear about Vladimir Putin, recruiting these people and sending them into Ukraine and just telling them it'll be a walk in the park. And I think something similar has been happening in Ethiopia.
Well,
but Abiy, in response to your second question,
let me just, I'm sorry, forgive me, but let me just, because, like I say, I was there 25 years ago, and I don't know that I had ever seen that level of poverty. Frankly, I'm not that well traveled, but I had traveled a little bit up to that point. And is there widespread use of cell phones? Is there any type of social media there? I mean, just, how is that type of, to lose hundreds of thousands of people, right, who are presumably your neighbors. I mean, there's, 100 million people. It's a big country. But you would need a tremendous amount of control, or a complete absence of any type of mechanism in which for people to talk.
It is quite extraordinary that it has been maintained like this for so long, and indeed in quite a lot of areas where there have been where communities have lost a lot, there is definitely a demand for this has to end. But it is also quite bizarre, and I don't really have a proper explanation for it, I have to say, for why it is possible for so many people to be willingly mobilized, because some of them are forced, there's no question, but many of them are just willingly joining the army. And perhaps it is simply because so many of them are so poor, there's so little employment. The economy, which was until very recently growing very fast, it was one of the fastest growing economies in the world. Now it's one of the fastest contracting economies. So young people are desperate for any sort of employment. But surely, for sure, there's going to be a huge backlash and price to pay and a social trauma arising from this.
Is it fair to kind of say that because of that kind of contraction in the economy, that the more nationalist rhetoric is more appealing?
I think the nationalist rhetoric actually was. It began when the economy was still expanding fast, and it was I think part of the problem was that the economy was visibly expanding, and these beautiful buildings were being built in the major cities, but there were still a lot of young people who felt we're not part of this, we're not actually getting the jobs that we want. And now, and then as it turns into a downward spiral with people being unable to afford the basics because of rampant inflation and factories closing and thousands of people being displaced from their farms and so on, then the search for culprits, for scapegoats, then becomes very intense.
And so the second part of my question, with basically forging a somewhat unstable or peace with Tigray, and then essentially turning their weapons on the Oroma, is there not an opportunity for some type of Tigrayan Oroma, I don't know, popular front, or what does that mean for going forward?
This was certainly being very much talked about a year ago when the Tigrayans were militarily on the offensive. But Prime Minister Abiy is a master of divide and rule. I mean, he may not have the skills of a nation builder or for managing the economy, etc., but he is very, very good at the sort of tactical day-to-day or week-to-week manipulation of politics. And he has so far, sort of managed this very skillfully, this dance among these different groups that could, if they combined, would certainly be able to force him from power. But he's used the resources he has, including he's had a fair amount of cash in hand from Middle Eastern backers like the United Arab Emirates, from Turkey, from the sale of key economic assets like the telecom system. He's used the resources he has to bribe and pay off whole segments of the political elite, and meanwhile going to and intimidating others. So even the Oromos, who are the ones who are currently suffering mostly in the war, are very divided. So it is partly a war of Amhara forces against Oromo forces, but it's also Oromo versus Oromo. There is an internal conflict going on there, and Abiy is very capably turning these communities against each other, which is dreadful but effective.
Well, Alex de Waal, Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation and Professor at Tufts University Fletcher School of Law and Policy, I really appreciate your walking us through this conflict, and perhaps we can catch up with you again sometime in 2023 to get a sense of how this has developed, and maybe we'll have more questions for you then. But this has been a really educational for me personally, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, and I hope I'll have some more optimistic answers to give next time we speak.
Yes, indeed. Thanks again,
Thanks,
Alex de Waal. We will put a link to some of what you've written over the past couple months on this conflict. Thank you again.
Thank you very much.